Good morning, everyone, or noon. Thank you all for coming over the lunch hour, and I saw several of you already at the Dunbar Community Center yesterday, so thank you for that as well. So what I want to do is kind of explain what this ReLocal thing is and how it came to be, and then specifically what we're doing here in Little Rock, and then some of the things that you can expect when we're done, how they work and so forth. Yeah, the next one. I'm Brian's right, I'm mostly a consultant in this firm, but I take a little detour every spring. I teach a class up at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia on the economics of historic preservation. And it's both the least profitable and most fun of anything I do, and I learn far more from my students than they ever learned from me. But a couple of years ago, I had a student who wrote her master's thesis on the role of historic preservation in what's called the right-sizing movement. Well, I didn't know what right-sizing, but I kind of read her thesis and said, oh, this is kind of interesting. And then you can go to the next one. So this right-sizing thing, it's kind of the term that this shrinking cities thing has evolved into. And the kind of standardized definition now is this: readjusting a shrinking city's built environment, its buildings and infrastructure, to match its current and projected population and development trends. Well, you hear that and you say, oh, you must be talking about Cleveland and Detroit and Buffalo, and that's certainly part of it. But what we learned as we kind of got started in this is that wasn't the whole thing at all. In fact, between the two most recent census, there were 450 cities around the country, in fact, who lost population in that decade. And while 5 of them were kind of big cities, over 500,000 people, 50 were between, in the Little Rock range of between 100 and 500,000, 110 were 50 to 100, and almost 240 were between 20,000 and 50. So it's all sizes of cities. But also, it's not just in the industrial Northeast that it's happening all over. 41 states lost, in fact, had at least one city that lost population. That even in the states that we think of as growth states, like Florida and California and Arizona, had cities that shrank in population. But the other thing, and this is particularly where Little Rock comes into play, and we didn't know this starting out, we learned it in the kind of year we spent trying to understand this right-sizing thing, is that there are cities in the United States where the city as a whole is growing in population, but that there are neighborhoods within the city that in fact may be shrinking and can use these kind of right-sizing tools. So we spent a year driving around the country, thinking, talking to people, reading stuff, doing research, to say, all right, if finally cities, you know, for the strategy for 50 years was, oh, next year everybody's going to come back. Well, these cities finally figured out that ain't going to happen. And so we need to make kind of systematic analysis of what's our strategy going to be. And my capitalist side, frankly, said, well, if cities are finally systematically doing that, and there was kind of broad agreement, we did a bunch of research, broad agreement that historic preservation ought to be part of this right-sizing strategy, but largely isn't, then my capitalist side says, well, then maybe there's an opportunity to see if we can figure out ways to help cities figure out what to do. And that evolved itself into this, what we're doing here in Little Rock this week, and really over the last month, called ReLocal. That is really a data-based analysis tool of comparative neighborhoods or comparative areas within a neighborhood to help, originally help municipalities to figure out how we allocate scarce resources. And it's based on about 75 or 78 types of measurements in 8 broad categories that you see here: walkability, environmental, stability of the neighborhood, engagement, and so forth. And I'll talk about what those components. And so within those 8 broad categories, there's about 75 or 78 individual variables. So here's kind of what the process is. We go through public databases, and those are things like census records, like local assessment data, like foreclosure patterns, things that we can get on a kind of public access basis. And my colleague Bree Paxton has been working about 6 weeks putting data together on that. And then we gather local information that may not be available on that public thing. And again, Brian has been fabulous about just saying, here's more data, here's stuff. So from the county, from the city, from local resources to plug in that. And then a third area is field work, stuff we're doing today and the rest of the week, and I'll come back to that. So we take those measurements from those three sources, and so we have these now metrics. But you know, I'm from Washington, D.C. My colleague Bree is from Muncie, Indiana. My other colleague, Emily, who's here, is from New York City. We don't pretend to have the kind of nuanced understanding of what's really important to people who live in this part of Little Rock are. And so accompanying this kind of quantitative basis is a qualitative survey input at the neighborhood level of what's important. Here's where I live, and here's what's important to me in my neighborhood. And so we will use that data, in fact, to tinker with our weightings. To the neighborhood A may say, well, being close to the school is more important than being close to jobs. I don't know what the answers will be, but we'll take those local inputs then and adjust our measurements to really reflect the relative importance of things to the people in that neighborhood. Next one. So here's these 8 broad categories, and I'll just give you some examples. So in the category called economic opportunity, we look at things like what's the aggregate household income? Is there a local business association? Are there employment centers in the neighborhood? Those are the kind of things I'm sorry you can't read them very well. Look at things like on walkability. We will there's a thing called walkscore.com where you can put in any address in America and it'll give you a walk score, how good it is for a walking neighborhood from 0 to 100. We will calculate the walk scores of every block in the whole study area so we understand the relative walkability of all of those areas in the neighborhood. So here's what it really is intended to do. Take a whole bunch of data and that the city or the client, that the whomever, and I'll come back to that in a minute, can use that to kind of say, here is the direction that both this neighborhood, or in case of Little Rock, kind of sub-neighborhood areas, that it's going, and its direction. Next one. And then use the context of the neighborhood to make decisions on a property level basis. A couple of things I think that are important. Place Economics, my firm is really kind of known as an historic preservation consulting firm, and we do a lot of that. There's kind of our big client base. But this specifically is not an historic preservation tool. In fact, it was funded by the State Historic Preservation Office. But out of those 75 or 78 variables, there's not more than 4 or 5 that have anything to do with historic preservation. There are a much broader range of kind of urban quality indicators. Having said that, and in a place where the population is shrinking, the reality is there will need to be some demolition. There's no question about that. But our observations from around the country is that unfortunately what happens is that when demolition is done, it's on a very ad hoc basis. That some city council member goes to the public works director and say, I'm tired of looking at that house, go tear it down, and that happens the next day. Well, maybe the place needs to be torn down, but that old real estate cliche about the 3 most important things in real estate are location, location, location. We firmly believe that demolition decisions in particular should be based not just on the 4 walls and roof of that particular house, but what's the context? What's happening in the neighborhood? What's happening on that block? And if you have enough money to demolish 10 houses and you have 100 of them that ought to be demolished, well then you ought to have some system to set priorities on where those scarce resources go. And if you have a choice of demolishing 2 houses in the identical condition, and we'll say that they're kind of poor condition and need to go, one of them is in the middle of 6 other vacant lots, and the other is in the midst of an otherwise stable block. Well, maybe the second one, your strategy should be, let's figure out how to stabilize and rehabilitate that one and use our scarce dollars to demolish the other. So that's really what it's for, to have a larger context within which to make these individual decisions. Here was our original objectives, and I can talk at the end about how we've really learned from this process and how these have changed over time, is to kind of help municipalities, and again, originally we thought that those would be our clients, and in Little Rock it is, allocate scarce resources among neighborhoods, use the appropriate tools, that there are different kinds of right-sizing tools that are appropriate for different situations, different contexts, different buildings, and to make this demolition when it takes place on kind of a strategic, to help make things better rather than just kind of an odd ad hoc, oh, I guess I'll tear down that one today basis. So that's the kind of background and the why of it and what we're doing. So what are we doing here in Little Rock and why? Next one. I mentioned that here is the broad area that we are addressing. And we understand that these aren't, some of these sub areas aren't kind of official lines in anybody's book, but it gives us a way to make relative comparisons among areas in this broader part of Little Rock. Next one. But here is the why. Little Rock, in fact, is one of those situations where the city itself is still growing in population. Now, I understand some of that's from annexation and other things, but between the year 2000 and 2013, in fact, the population of the city of Little Rock grew about 6%, but the population in that study area shrank by about 15%. So here you have a city that's growing, but a neighborhood that's not. It's losing population. And that's to say, well, then that maybe calls for some right sizing, and what are the breadth of tools that ought to be appropriate there. So then in this broad area, we have shrunk down to these sub areas with really detailed looks at each of those. This just happens to be what we've identified as the east area. Go ahead. So this is just to give you a little sample of the kinds of things that we're looking at that Brianna has been working on for the last 6 weeks. So here is just a simple map of here's the parcels in the areas. There are where the park areas are there. Next one. And that came from city data, as did this. Here's where the demolitions have been in the last 15 years. A lot of them. B, spread all over. So every time you see one of these little, and sometimes not so little, but red marks, that means that sometime in the last 15 years a demolition took place there. So again, here's this framework, here's the overall strategy. Go ahead. So this is what we're doing this week. And many of you have already done it. But we have around 60 volunteers or 70 volunteers who have volunteered to spend 4 hours or 8 or 16 between yesterday and Saturday to go out, and I'll tell you exactly what they're doing, but go out. Our intention as part of this process is every one of the 8,000 parcels in that study area will be surveyed as part of this process, and I'll tell you what that is. So that's what's going on this week. Next one. And then what's going to go on over the next month, and it's already up and ready. If you want to go and fill it out, please do, is the community survey, so we can get community input on what are the particular importance to you. I live in the eastern part of your study area, and what's really important to me is that there's a bike path, or that the real estate values are stable, or that there be new construction. There's a whole range of things, and that's what we want to understand. What, in very localized basis, what's important right in that area. Next one. So the survey itself, or the field work survey, what people are out in the field as we speak doing now, really is looking at this neighborhood character aspect, because that's really not something that you can call up a census data form and understand. You need to really look at those properties individually, one by one. And what the surveyors are looking is these kind of broad areas. What's the building condition? Now, we're not, structural engineers. Nobody's going to go and take measurements in some scale to see if there's a tilt at the wall, but a generalized judgment. And many of you have gone through it, but my colleague Emily does a really good training on here's what we mean, and then we have a field manual that they go out with photos. So this is a building that you'd probably call in the poor condition. This is one you'd probably call in good or whatever. It's not going to be perfect. No, somebody's going to have a little different answer, but it's going to give us a general sense of these criteria. Building condition, its architectural character. Is it a mixed-use building, or could it be? So you have some great examples in the area of often, but not always, corner buildings that were clearly built as some commercial operation, probably a little market in the ground floor and a residential unit in the upfloor. I'm not here to make policy recommendations, but when this whole kind of nationally pattern about walkability being important, about you need to have access to food, for example, at the neighborhood level, you ought to have, well, maybe, and I'm just saying maybe, that those are kind of buildings I'll say, geez, is there a way to use those for business incubators to have somebody start up a little neighborhood market or a little neighborhood cafe or what? I don't know, but we're going to try to identify what those opportunities are in the neighborhood. What is the land being used for? Again, we are surveying both buildings and parcels that have no building on them. And so how is it being used? Is it a parking lot? Is it a garden? Is it just a vacant lot? Is it a playground? How is the property being maintained? Again, good, great, and not so great. What's the condition of the sidewalk? Now, what I strongly suspect, although I've not yet looked at the demographic numbers, which we'll look at in all those neighborhoods, I expect that there's probably a disproportionate share of relatively older people in those neighborhoods. And if that's the case, and if walkability is important, then it's really important that you have good sidewalks. So we'll literally be able to map. Here's where the surveyor said the sidewalks are in good condition. Here's where they said they're in terrible condition. Here's where there's no sidewalks at all. That ought to be then a tool for the city saying, well, then that ought to be a priority for us to address those kind of issues. And then public graffiti and art. Is there, somebody put a little statue in that park or that area, or is there graffiti on the side of that building? So those are the kind of basic pieces of information that the field survey will do. It's a smartphone-based system. So you drive around, and you have a iPad or you have your cell phone, and you log in. And it asks a limited number of questions, so it doesn't take an hour to do it. And again, some of you are in the preservation world and understand what surveys for a historic district are. This is really not that. This is really kind of a windshield, quick take, so we can get broad understandings of the condition, the quality, and the character of these houses. And so we gather this information on a parcel-by-parcel basis. Next one. And then here's how it kind of works. We have contracted with a firm called ReLocal Data. It's a real kind of sophisticated an analytic tool. And so they'll take a map, they'll overlay our sub areas in the neighborhood, and then shrink that down so it's on the parcel level, and the city's parcel map is overlaid by Google Maps. So you see, okay, here's the lot line of that particular parcel. Next one. And then it shrinks even further. It kind of goes from this multi-block area to this is the block that I'm looking at. Go ahead. And then the smartphone will locate you. Say, oh, okay, I'm standing in the corner of 16th and, Chestnut or whatever. So the person, and this just comes from a screenshot of a surveyor. So, okay, I might be standing over here, and I'm saying, okay, this is the parcel that I want to survey. So that little blue thing, and I punched that and said, okay, I'm going to enter the data on that parcel. And it's this kind of simple data. Start out taking a photograph of the parcel. And by the way, that this system is set up is sometimes if we can't get a photo, or the photo's not good, or my cell phone's not working to do that, we have a backup, is we will have the Google Earth photos of every one of these parcels as well. So when we get our own photo, we'll have them both. If for any reason we can't get it, and candidly, sometimes I'm a little uncomfortable taking a picture of a house if somebody's sitting on the front porch. It's kind of invasive. So we've told people, don't do that. If you're uncomfortable, don't take the photo. We'll have that backup system. And then the kind of base question is there a building on the property? Yes or no? Next one. And then it goes through these whole series of things. The top of this is the last screen that you would see. It's what's the condition of the sidewalk? Is there graffiti? Is there public art? And then if you have some other little note to take, you put it in there, and then you put submit, and then it merges up with all of this data that everybody else is gathering about these properties. So here was yesterday morning, and some of you in this room are in that picture, I will point out. So here's Emily doing the training of volunteers yesterday morning. And then here's my colleague Bree, who's behind the desk over there giving out assignments, and people go out in teams of 2 or 3. And we tell them if you want to go and one walk one side of the street and one the other, that's great. If you want to kind of drive slowly down, they have 3 people and one of them drives slowly down the street and out of the back window, take both sides, you can do that, however you want to go. So here is, and again, this was from early yesterday afternoon, so I just want to show you how this is kind of coming out. So all of these red marks, those indicate that those have been surveyed, that somebody was at that part, and so what happens, it's really kind of cool. Everybody says submit, and then on Emily's computer pops up, well, that property is covered. And then if you're a surveyor and are saying, well, do I know if that property's been surveyed or not, your version of the map will show that that property's been done. Somebody did that, so do the one across the street. Next one. Here, kind of zooming in, this is Hanger Hill, I think. And so you can see that that was a place where the surveyors yesterday got a lot of work done. So a lot of those parcels got surveyed. And that's, by the way, a very wonderful neighborhood, I'll point out. But so that's that area. Next one. And I just did we just did preliminary data of what people were looking in. So here is that general area. Is there a building on the property? If it's purple, the answer was yes. If it's orangish, the answer was no. So what you can immediately see is some buildings there, but there's also a lot of vacant lots. And that either can be a kind of a drag neighborhood or it can be opportunity, and that's kind of how we use that as strategy. Next one. And then here are buildings that were identified as, it appears, vacant. So not only do you have a whole lot of vacant land, you have a number of these buildings. Again, I don't mean this to be any conclusive thing at all, just to give you a sense of the kind of information that will be gathered for the whole area. Next one. And then the community survey that really, really, really is important, because we want to make sure that we're tuned in to kind of the nuances of what's important. So there's kind of 2 versions to do it. You can go online, SurveyMonkey, and fill it out, send it in, and again, you don't have to identify yourself on the survey. We don't ask who you are. We ask kind of basic questions. I think there's 15 questions in all, but not everybody has access to internet. We understand that. So it's, go to the library, go to the church, go to someplace, or we've also prepared hard copies of it that Brian has circulated to the neighborhood centers, resource centers. So if you say, I don't have a computer, but or my grandma doesn't have a computer, but I want her to answer it, then go and get one, and we will integrate all of that. So we can't overstress how much we really want to make sure the neighborhood voice gets reflected in this. Next one. Now, attach no statistical significance to this whatsoever. This is just the 11 responses that came in early this morning on the survey. And I just took one question, but just to show you the kinds of things. So this particular question is, how important are the following neighborhood qualities to you? And we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 answers, and you ranked them from not important to 1 or very important to a 5. So I just took this one. So interestingly enough, the 2 highest, the highest percentage of the people who said very important were neighborhood look and feel, building character, and the ability to walk places nearby to parks or other green space. Now again, don't put no statistical attachment to this at all. This is a dozen responses, and by the time we're done, we hope to have several hundred. But just to give you an idea of the kind of things we're looking at. Next one. So we're going to do this stuff. We're here we've been working for 6 weeks, kind of on the broad data. We're here this week. We'll leave the survey open until the end of September to make sure as many people as possible can get an input. And then I think that our agreement with Brian is that we get a report back to the city in November. go ahead. So what's that going to be? Well, we will go on parcel by parcel and give building scores by character, quality, and condition. Now, I think another important thing to understand, our recommendations are only going to be on vacant parcels. We kind of take the position of, hey, if a neighborhood is declining in population, the last thing we want to do is say, oh, you're in the wrong house, we want to move you over there. No, if the business or the building is occupied, we're not making recommendations on that. You know, in some cases you might say, oh, we ought to get you a better house, but that's a kind of different issue. We want to deal with the vacant parcels. So we'll look at the buildings, we'll have these neighborhood scores in each of those 8 areas. So this neighborhood is very strong on the environmental side, but not so strong in the community engagement side, or whatever that is. And then we will take the community input, change our weightings based on that, and then finally provide a kind of tools and strategies for those vacant properties. Here is the kind of, when we first set out with ReLocal, on the neighborhood level, we had this kind of spectrum of possible overall neighborhood recommendations. From one end that says abandon residential use in this neighborhood, to the other end saying this is a place where you ought to think about repopulating. We're not anywhere near done with the study. I'm telling you, there's no one of those areas where it's going to be at this end of the spectrum. It just isn't. There are none of these where anybody's going to say, yeah, quit using it. No. We worked in cities where that was appropriate. This ain't one of them. And then kind of where along that spectrum each of those areas within our area look. Next one. On the property level, again, a whole range of possible kind of overall strategies, from demolition, and frankly, we will identify some properties that ought to be demolished. Those will tend to be properties in bad condition, bad quality, low maintenance, vacant, and in a context where kind of nothing else is happening to support it. That'll be the conditions where that'll be most likely. Up to areas where it ought to be rehabilitated. Maybe that's by the public sector, maybe by the private sector, but that's a property that really deserves attention and ranges in between. So on the building side, every vacant building in the area will have, in those broad areas, a recommendation to rehabilitate it, to stabilize it and wait, maybe to look at it as a demolition, raise and recycle, or some alternative use, or maybe a moving of those properties. For those of you who are not preservationists particularly, the kind of moving of historic properties is not ever seen as the kind of first choice, but sometimes it's not an inappropriate, final choice. Is given a great historic property replaced in a more appropriate neighborhood that might support it, might very well be an appropriate strategy in some limited issues. So that's what will happen to vacant buildings. On vacant lots, again, on every vacant lot, we will have a broad categorical recommendations of either infill, this is a good place for new stuff to go in, for active use, that might be a place for a park or a playground or something else. Passive use, that might be for a community garden or a kind of rest area, or just a side yard for somebody. Or utilitarian use, maybe that's a place where the city's floodplain could be expanded, or you can put another driveway or something else. So again, and we don't mean to say this is the only thing that can happen. What we're trying to do is kind of give general guidance, because I'm telling you, manna could fall from heaven, and the city of Little Rock is not going to have enough resources to do everything that ought to be done between now and Thanksgiving. It's just not going to happen. So what we're trying to do is recognize when there's scarce resources, maybe here's where your priorities ought to be. So for every vacant building, we have these 4 opportunity categories, we call them. So that is, rehabilitate, stabilize, and wait, whatever. Within those, 3 to 5 strategies about how that might take place, and for each of them 4 or 5 tools that either currently exist in Little Rock or exist other places that might be a good implementation tool for that. On the vacant lot, the kind of same situation for every vacant parcel. We'll have kind of This is one for infill, this is one for passive use, and then the strategies and tools appropriate to that. What we're hoping, and again, here's what we've learned as we've done this stuff. We originally thought that who we'd be giving guidance to is the municipality. And that hasn't changed, but what we've learned is there are lots of players in neighborhoods other than the city. And oftentimes they're totally different agendas, not out of some evil intent. It's just people going, oh, I got my deal and I'm going to do it. Where in fact the neighborhood could be better served if there was some coordination between the city and the school district and the land bank and a community development corporation and the church's housing department, whatever those are, so that one of our hopes is this will be used much wider than just by the city, by others who have an active role in those neighborhoods. We have a kind of theory on implementation. First of all is that preservation side of the thing, it should be as a means, not an end. That we ought to be not saving old buildings because they're old buildings. We ought to save them because they're a contributor. They ought to serve some broader purpose. Next one. Second is there needs to be priorities. You just can't effectively deal with neighborhoods if you say, oh, we got a big problem, and kind of randomly try to address it. Third, and this is particularly true of historic buildings, but not exclusively, there ought not to be one set of standards for everything. There needs to be a more nuanced of, here's the way this building or this typology or the building in this neighborhood be treated as opposed to another one. Data-driven is that the decisions, they're hard, they're tough decisions, and they ought not be driven just because, oh, well, I don't like that guy, so let's demo his house. There ought to be some other basis. Assemble the tools, that if you're going to address neighborhood issues, you need to have the tools that you need to do that effectively. Well, thank you very much for taking your lunch hour to be here. And again, if you could come out and survey, we'd love to have you, because we have 7,000 more properties to go. But also the community survey, it's really going to directly affect kind of what our recommendations are at the end, so we could use all your help. So thank you all very much.